everybody. I'm Sue, and it's time to pump it up.
I'm obsessed. When you touch my lips, I'm obsessed.
It would be futile to try to find a descriptor for Coralie Farjat's 2024 gonzo feminist Jeremiah The Substance that both captures the spirit of the film and hasn't already been tried. The film has drawn comparisons to everything from Fight Club to The Fly, and I think they're all valid ways of asking the question, why do we keep doing this to ourselves? Now, the film is hardly subtle in its feminine rage as it acts as an indictment of the capitalist abuse of women's commodified bodies. But that's not to say that the women who participate in that abuse get off much easier. It reminds me a little of that moment in Batman Returns, where a woman on the street is saved by Catwoman who then scolds her for making herself such an easy target. The Substance, though, is less a victim-blaming movie than a warning that, yes, the leopards will eat your face. And yet that tends to be the criticism for why the film doesn't work for some people. The fact that lead character Elizabeth Sparkle's rage is scattershot, targeted both at the disgusting men that employ her and her own body for failing on her, doesn't provide the catharsis I think a lot of people were hoping for. And for others, it's manna from heaven. Anger doesn't have to be justified or focused in order for it to be valid. And it doesn't have to be cleansing or helpful. There needn't be a learning experience at the end of it, nor does it need to be empowering. A woman can hate her own body, and the men who taught her to hate it. Farjat's film is incredibly French that way.
And yet at its core, The Substance harkens back to the lessons of classic sci-fi thrillers about using science to try to conquer the natural world.
Which is why one apt descriptor of the film might be the best adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde this century.
The Substance tells the tale of Elizabeth Sparkle, a woman who is at a forced end of her career as a fitness celebrity and serious actress, thanks to Hollywood's rigid rules for women's bodies and its constant lust for the next big thing.
Find me somebody new!
After a car accident, Elizabeth is given a black market drug known only as the Substance, which can generate a younger, more perfect version of Elizabeth.
Everything comes from you, and everything is you.
What emerges, after a gnarly birthing sequence that would make David Cronenberg squirm, is Margaret Qualley's Sue. And yes, Farjat's camera lingers on Sue's body, exploring every inch to drive home the contrast between Qualley's firm, tight, and smooth frame, and Demi Moore's slightly sagging body that shows signs of a futile war against aging for Moore, and by extension Elizabeth. The trick is that each woman gets 7 days of consciousness, while the other rests and is nourished intravenously. And if they go over the allotted time, the other's body begins to deteriorate. Of course, Sue is wildly successful in taking Elizabeth's old spot as the world's sexiest, well, everything it seems. Down come Elizabeth's billboards and up go ones for Sue's new booty boot camp show.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sue, and it's time to pump it up.
Sue is interviewed on the hottest talk shows. Sue spends her nights at the club, and with a new hunk every night. She's also chosen to host the network's New Year's Eve celebration. Obviously, Sue's success is based on men finding her incredibly gorgeous. The network executives are basically sub-Weinstein-level goofs who are enamored with this pretty young thing. But the underlying reason is that she reestablishes the social order that they're comfortable with.
You're hired. We want a show that's just like you. Beautiful and happy.
The male-dominated network, represented here by a grotesque caricature in the form of Dennis Quaid, discards Elizabeth, who is failing to act as an ideological role model, and replaces her with the embodiment of hyperfemininity. Hyperfemininity is the natural flip side to the hypermasculinity coin. The hyperfeminine ideal is physically flawless with smooth skin, perfect hair, a curvy figure, and meticulous grooming. And since those things rarely occur naturally, there's an expectation that one will strive for that ideal through makeup, surgery, injections, pills, and supplements. Along with that goes an expectation that the flawlessness will be used in service of sexuality, with more revealing clothing, flirting, and prioritizing the sexual pleasure of men.
You got to bump it up, don't you know?
In other words, the hyperfeminine ideal is a being entirely created by men, but fulfilled by women who seek the reward, attention, and power those men can grant them. This is why Farjah doesn't paint Elizabeth as a sympathetic character in the film. At least not entirely. Elizabeth craves celebrity, and the fuel that powers celebrity is the parasocial contract, an unspoken agreement between an audience member and a celebrity that the audience will give time, effort, money, and attention to the celebrity as long as the celebrity keeps up whatever their end of the bargain is. The trick for a celebrity is recognizing accurately what it is that the audience is buying and continuing to offer that.
People love you. They adore you. They want more and more and more of you.
And if a celebrity slips out of touch with what their audience is buying, the audience not only can sever the contract, but the backlash can be severe. For an Elizabeth Sparkle, we the audience will give her enough fame to get her own star on the walk, we'll support her for awards and bigger roles, and we'll tune into her fitness show, as long as she continues to give us a boner. That is the unspoken exchange. And Elizabeth has violated that contract, through no fault of her own, just time and biology.
We need her young. We need her hot. We need her now.
And the moral of the story isn't that Elizabeth comes to reject the sexual economy. At every point, she desperately tries to claw her way back in, including using Sue and her body as a confederate. Despite an ocean and over a century of time separating the two works, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Substance have a lot in common, with the caveat being that in The Substance, it's the Hyde character that takes the potion to create the Jekyll. Elizabeth takes the potion to create a hyper-feminine, and therefore more desirable version of herself. Dr. Jekyll does the opposite, unleashing his hyper-masculine id. Stevenson's story alternates between traditional third-person narration and epistolary as it tells the tale of the titular Dr. Jekyll, a proper but arrogant scientist who develops a potion that turns him into the crass and violent Mr. Hyde. What gets lost if you only rely on the story's reputation or Bugs Bunny cartoons is the heavy Victorian influence. It's more than just setting the story in foggy, ripper-infested London streets. The repressive nature of Victorianism is the fuel that drives the story. It's a story about two competing forms of masculinity. Dr. Jekyll's more refined and controlled Victorian gentleman, with its drive to conquer the world using science, and what could be more masculine than that? And Mr. Hyde's feral barbarism and whoring, and what could be more masculine than that? While the novella uses some epistolary techniques such as statements and documents, the framing device surrounding the story is a conversation between two Victorian gentlemen. So we get a sense of their utter disdain for Hyde's antics and sadness and confusion over Jekyll's fall. Jekyll is your garden variety Victorian protagonist, married to Enlightenment ideals of scientific progress and reason, while also feeling frustrated by rigid Victorian morality. For the uninitiated, repression is the impetus for Jekyll concocting his cursed potion in the first place. Jekyll is morally repressed, even for Victorian England, thinking that the more visible and more distinguished one became, the more respectable he was obligated to be to fit the archetype. The general requirements for a Victorian gentleman are impeccable appearance. A Victorian gentleman is always dressed without blemish. Upholding moral values. A Victorian gentleman is a pillar of morality and virtue. He is a man of his word, and his actions always align with his principles, chivalry and courtesy. A true gentleman treats everyone with respect, demonstrating chivalry towards women and courtesy towards all, education and intellect. A Victorian gentleman is a man of knowledge and culture, emotional restraint. A Victorian gentleman keeps his emotions in check. That is a lot of structure, and you can understand why most people would want to cut loose once in a while. And most people do. But not Jekyll. He's ashamed of wanting to cut loose. It's a sign of a weak will and a weak man. Real men control their urges. And the other half of him, the half that wanted to carpe that diem, felt restrained, but also shamed. I mean, what else would one feel if the person they were closest to tried to keep them hidden at all times, lest that person experience social judgment from his peers? It just so happens that, in Jekyll's case, the guilt and the shame are embodied in the same physical body. Therein lies the dichotomy of manhood. Victorian men would argue that the height of masculinity is restraint of their baser urges. An evolutionary psychologist would see the rigid Victorian rules as denying men's true nature. In his book Danse Macabre, Stephen King gives a lengthy analysis of this dichotomy, likening it to the Greek gods Apollo, who approached life with more of a sense of duty to excellence, and Dionysus, who approached it as a series of indulgences to be experienced. Jekyll theorizes that if he could separate the Apollonian side of his personality from the Dionysian side, the Jekyll of him would be free to research, to study, and to help humanity, unfettered by the creeping temptation of rage and debauchery. Meanwhile, the Dionysian side could Frank Reynolds his way across Soho without the encumbrance of guilt. There's something Nietzschean about Jekyll's insistence on creating the potion that births Hyde, as if you can research your way outside of morality. Instead, what happens is they share the same body, with Hyde cutting an angry swath through London, and Jekyll feeling consumed by guilt over unleashing Hyde upon the world. In the end, Jekyll allows Hyde to kill them both in order to end the hard experiment, knowing that Hyde is the only one between the two of them that has the nerve to do it. In The Substance, Sue is a different kind of monster for a different kind of story. Along with the rigid social mores of Stevenson's era, came a reckoning about women's bodies. To a Victorian man, a woman was necessary for procreation and child-rearing, and to some extent she was a status symbol for her husband. But she wasn't a person in the same sense that a man was. Procreation was complicated, though, by periods and aging and diseases yet to be named. While in the Victorian era these were burdens bared by men, they were the problems, and therefore the responsibilities, of women. That meant that both women's sexual pleasure and sexual dysfunction were taboo subjects among Victorian men, which led to excessive paranoia and magical thinking about women's bodies. And since Victorian England was still the dominant cultural exporter to the United States at the time, it largely informed our cultural values in ways that are still felt to this day. That meant that those fears manifested in art and literature in ways that were both explicit and sublime. Female monsters, as a result, often represented a loss of the control the Victorian society was meant to erect. Witches weren't just spellcasters. The spells they cast upset the male-dominated order of the world. And because the Victorian trope was to indicate villainy through some sort of physical deformity, the witch almost always had some element of physical hagness to her, usually in the form of skin malformities, poor posture, or thinning hair. This is unless the point is that she is misrepresenting her appearance in order to trick men. You know, through the use of glamours and potions and optical illusions, or makeup, surgeries, injections, pills, and supplements. That's why the weird gynophobic set can keep impossible beauty standards and jokes about taking a girl swimming on the first date, or come up with entire schematics that document any potential, quote-unquote, masculine traits in potential sex partners. The solution for Forjat is to opt out of the patriarchal sexual economy, which is why Sue's creation is a betrayal of that ethos. The feminine monster is supposed to tear down the patriarchy, not join it. This point is driven home by one of those weird retro AI trailers from the channel We Hate Popcorn But Eat It Anyway, that reimagines The Substance as a 1980s movie. It casts that then early 20s Demi Moore in the role of Sue and Jane Fonda in the role of Elizabeth. And that's not that far off from what really happened. When Demi Moore, Sharon Stone, and Julia Roberts ascended to the top of the Hollywood A-list in the 1990s, it pushed aside the Jane Fondas, Diane Keatons, and Jessica Langes, who suddenly found themselves in the mom roles supporting the main characters, the real characters. To some extent, it matters when you come into the story. It's both possible to recognize that Demi Moore's frustration with fewer Hollywood roles the past 20 years is valid, while also recognizing that the reason she had that opportunity in the first place was because they stopped giving those roles to Susan Sarandon and made her do other things. Besides, we all know that sleazy 1980s studio exec would have been played by James Woods, not Michael Douglas. The problem for both protagonists is that Elizabeth and Dr. Jekyll create their alter egos from a place of shame and self-loathing. Jekyll hates the fact that he has these base urges like a common afternoon farmer, and Elizabeth hates her body for failing on her. Elizabeth's validation is entirely extrinsic. She bases her self-esteem on her show, her audience, and the attention from men at the network. She doesn't seem to have any friends. And that's why she doesn't do anything except become a spectator to Sue's success, spending most of the day eating in front of the television. When the show is taken away from her, she has no way to receive the praise that she needs, at least not praise that she can accept. No doubt the most emotionally harrowing scene comes when Elizabeth accepts a date from an old high school classmate. But haunted by the smallest imperfections in her body and a looming, mocking billboard of Sue overlooking her apartment, Elizabeth finds herself paralyzed by anger and self-loathing. She returns to the mirror multiple times, trying to fix the flaws that only she seems to be able to see, before ultimately collapsing and missing her date. And because Sue is made from Elizabeth, there is an undercurrent of loathing for Elizabeth that resides inside of Sue. Elizabeth's body becomes a chore to take care of. It's an embarrassment that has to be hidden. And it's an albatross that cramps Sue's style. But as much as Sue despises Elizabeth's body, it's just a reflection of how Elizabeth feels about herself. The result is a proxy war between the two women. While Elizabeth created Sue to preserve everything she'd built over the previous 30 years, Sue goes about tearing it down, both literally and metaphorically. So Elizabeth begins to sabotage the luxury apartment, forcing Sue to waste part of her precious time cleaning. And Sue repays her by inching more and more to overstaying her time, almost mocking Elizabeth with her perfect body whenever she gets a chance. These body issues are contrasted with portrayal of men's faces and physiques in grotesque ways. Dennis Quaid, who stepped in after Ray Liotta passed away, is doing his best Vegas Liotta impression. And his lines are dripping with oblivious sleaze as he slurps his way through shrimp cocktail lunch and leers at every woman who comes within a 6-foot radius. The best and most obvious rhetorical moment, though, comes as Farjah cuts between Elizabeth's elderly ass and the hairy ass of one of Sue's male hookups. It's a stark reminder that this is the male ass on a good day. The message, with portrayal of men and their bodies in this film, is clearly, this? This is who you're trying to impress? Due to Sue's selfishness and overstaying the 7-day window, Elizabeth's body begins to deteriorate further and further, just as Jekyll's sanity and desire to live deteriorated, until finally she wants to pull the plug, ending the substance and, with it, Sue's life. But she finds that she can't. Left hideous and decrepit, robbed of the beauty that she did have in one of those old EC comic ironic punishments, Elizabeth determines that Sue is the only part of her that has any value left. Unlike Hyde, who comes to be an odious embarrassment for Jekyll, Elizabeth's glorification of the hyperfeminine ideal, which she used to embody, leads her to value Sue even over her own life. In other words, Elizabeth thinks that she's the Hyde of the story, the feminine monster that needs to be hid from view. And there's no surprise why. That's the way she's being treated. I've seen a lot of very valid criticism online about this film being hagsploitation, a subgenre of film that explores themes of aging, power, and sexuality among women over 40. And I think some people who are talking about hagsploitation in the negative sense assume that it refers simply to using women's aging bodies to horrify people. But it's important to recognize that Elizabeth is a hag at the beginning of the movie, not just when Sue starts to abuse her body. She's already being fired for being too old and unattractive by the network. Yes, an aged Demi Moore is too unattractive for public consumption. Not Elizabeth, Demi Moore. The substance really only works as a meta-commentary on the sex object economy if you have someone whose body was widely scrutinized by the same American public that this film is designed for. It was the earlier hagsploitation films of the 1960s and 1970s that allowed us to question the way that we portray older women in media and the expectations we had for them in our society. But that, in itself, was a deconstruction of the helpful old biddy trope that was pervasive in the early half of the 20th century. The idea that Aunt Bee had a thing for the butter and egg man was cute, but the idea of Aunt Bee having any real physical sexual desire was anathema. The hag is almost always presented as bitter and ugly. It's her own ambition and her own self-interest that are reflected in her external ugliness and represent how malicious she is, because of the self-interest. In many ways, this is also similar to the Bette Davis and Baxter classic All About Eve, in which aging star Bette Davis finds her spot usurped and supplanted by the younger, more attractive Baxter. The difference is that Davis's character, Margot, learns to accept the pecking order and finds a sort of smug comfort in knowing that eventually someone will come for Eve's spot. And indeed, at the end of the film, a new potential ingenue arrives and catches the eye of influential drama critic Addison DeWitt. In contrast, Elizabeth's own egotism prevents her from being able to grow in the same way that Margot does. Her self-centeredness is literally on the walls, and it's why, when given an opportunity to relive her life as a younger version of herself, the only thing that she can think to do is re-enter the sexual panopticon that imprisoned her in the first place. And that's where Sue winds up. With Elizabeth's body dead and decaying, Sue's body also starts to fall apart. So she tries an ill-advised Hail Mary, using the substance on herself to give birth to an even more perfect version. But this is a satire after all, and what is produced is Monstro Eliza Sue, a hunchback conglomeration of Sue and Elizabeth that sneaks into the New Year's Pumpin' Eve show and winds up spewing blood all over the audience, and a Carrie-esque indictment of the consumption of women's bodies. And with that, no one gets off easily. This is a censure of both Sue and Elizabeth for stabbing each other in the back, to the Gross Network boys for being Gross Network boys, and to the audience who lusted over Sue's body the whole time while throwing Elizabeth on the trash heap. But it's also a condemnation of the society that sets up this sexual economy and treats young women's bodies as disposable. While Stevenson's book is ambiguous over whether it's an intentional indictment of Victorian values or an ode to them, it's clear how Farjah wants The Substance to be seen.
The Substance is a film about women's bodies, about how women's bodies are scrutinized, fantasized about, criticized in the public space, about how much as women we are led to believe that we have no choice but to be perfect, sexy, smiling, thin, young, beautiful to be valued in society, and how impossible it is for women to escape this, no matter how educated, strong-minded, and independent we may be. Because for more than 2,000 years, women's bodies have been shaped and controlled by the desires of those who were looking at them.
And you can't get much more straightforward than that. Like Stevenson's novel, which explored the tensions between the social expectations of gender and trying to be a real honest-to-goodness human being, The Substance asks the audience to question the extent to which we contribute to the objectification and degradation of women.
You will never be enough, but you can know the value of your work if you just put down the measuring stick.
Stay warm, stay safe, wash your hands, return your shopping carts, maybe give yourself a break, and I'll see you next time.
I never thought the leopards would eat my face. No, I never thought the leopards would eat my face.